Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Coach and Benway podcast. Today, we're going to be discussing in detail Professor Ryszard Legutko's book, The Demon in Democracy. This book is really interesting, and Professor Benway, why don't you give us the précis of the book before we dive into the topic?
Well, I got upgraded to professor from doctor.
I'm sorry.
I'm gonna take that. No, I'll take it. So this is an interesting book. For those of you who paid attention to our discussion of why liberalism failed, you're going to find that this book kind of feels repetitive about that in certain areas, a slightly different take in other areas. I think it's not easier to read than the Why Liberalism Failed. I think that's just a much quicker, easier read. This is a little bit rougher, a little bit feels like a collection of notes from a professor. The writer is a professor, but he's also a politician. It feels like a very Polish book. There are references not just to what's going on in Poland, but there's even references to Polish literature and philosophy going on here that you probably wouldn't get if you didn't know where it was coming from. So it's definitely not easier, but I think it has a harsher and sharper to the fucking point attitude towards it, which is to say, look, with the demon in democracy, look, there is not just a relationship that's going on with liberalism and communism. He noticed in Poland that it was just so easy for former communists to adopt the liberal credo without much stress and struggle, even though they were nominally enemies throughout the Cold War. But it was that there is just fundamentally within the liberal system a totalitarian tendency, something that just eases in so readily to this attitude that hitherto you probably, if you had lived like we all do in the West, and you take all of the stuff that your teachers tell you in civics class, without any salt, you would believe, this is insane. How could you even conceive of this? Well, he actually tries to present it in a way that I think is fairly coherent.
I think that notion, it's the book jumps off. The Demon in Democracy basically is saying that the liberal democracy that we currently live in is a lot closer to communism than we understand or realize. And the jumping off point of the book is that he says how the communists adopted liberal democracy so easily, and the anti-communists rather were marginalized. It was the anti-communists, i.e., the communists, the old apparatchiks of the communist regime in Poland, at least, who adopted liberal democracy easily, without any kind of problem whatsoever, and just got hip to the new lingo of the new ideology. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss kind of situation. And I think that's, how can I put it? Look, I'll. Like I was telling Dr. Benway before we started recording, this book has had a profound impact on me, or let me phrase that. Both this book and Why Liberalism Failed has had a profound impact on me for the following reason. Before reading these two books, or let me rephrase it, in general, I'm all in favor of entertaining ideas that I might not really believe. Like it's all good and fine to talk about the idea of the brain in the vat. And yeah, sure, I can entertain that idea and, toy with the idea that maybe I truly am a brain in the vat and that there are these mad scientists who are just stimulating my brain in such a way that I perceive the reality around me. But the fact of the matter is this reality, quote unquote, around me, it's fake, it's fictitious, it's a matrix. I'm really a brain in a vat, right? And I can entertain that idea and play with it for quite a while. Not just that idea, but any idea. But there's a big difference for me, at least, between entertaining an idea and coming to believe it. Okay, I can entertain the idea of being truly a brain in a vat for long stretches of time without really believing it. Before and during the time that I read both Why Liberalism Failed and Demon in Democracy, I was entertaining the idea that I was subject to an ideology, that this notion of liberal democracy was an ideology and that I was in its grips, sort of like the brain in the vat, right? I was just entertaining the idea, but I didn't really believe it. It was just something like a cool idea to play with and toy with. But it's only as of late that I start to think about it harder. And the catalyst was this book, as a matter of fact, that I come to the conclusion that, yeah, I am living in the grips of an ideology. And the people around me are living in the grips of an ideology, and we don't realize it. But that doesn't change the fact that we are. We're living under the grips of an ideology that makes us think certain ways and makes us believe that certain attitudes are okay, are acceptable, and certain other attitudes are not acceptable.
Well, and I had responded to you that to me this was not as much of a shock, or let me put it this way, it wasn't as dramatic for me as it was for you, in part because I already studied a lot of Marxism. I was part of a Marxist philosophical reading group for a period of time. So not only did I know from their own perspective the critiques that you would get of liberalism, its own inability to live up to its own goals, but I also knew, historically speaking, that Marx was a good liberal.
Yeah.
If you really look at what he was trying to do, he said that liberalism is failing by its own definitions. This mechanism that I have created, which is a scientific method in his mind, as scientific as anything produced during the liberal age of enlightenment. His idea was it's going to take it to the next level.
Yeah.
He was an avid reader of Adam Smith. He fundamentally believed a lot of what Adam Smith wrote was fundamentally true. He saw it, there was, like I said, the science of his philosophy, and he was going to take it to that level. I mean, this is not a shock. And in fact, if you really look at what the Marxists really believed, this is how you can tell an ignorant Marxist versus someone who actually read it. True Marxist will never really go and say capitalism is absolutely evil, full stop. That you just haven't read Marx if you believe that. He thinks capitalism is the great engine that has caused these changes which have undermined the old order. If you look at Marxist history, capitalism is better than feudalism in their mind, and the next step takes it to the next step. It is part of this, fundamental changing mechanism. I've said before, Marx was a big fan of Abraham Lincoln. Marxists believed that the American Revolution, the French Revolution, were important, were valuable. They said they were the great bourgeois revolutions, and they didn't mean that critically entirely. Yeah. They meant that in a good, positive sense, that this is the first step, and we're going to go to the next step. This is all part of the same notion that you're going to get in this book that I think it does a fairly good job articulating, which is there was a fundamental change in how you believe history operates, how you believe time operates, and the attitude towards religion kind of underlines a lot of these things. Yeah, the attitude towards religion you get from liberalism and communism.
Yeah, because what happens to me is that, see, I never studied Marxism. I studied Marxist and communist and socialist countries and their history in some detail. But I actually never got around to studying Marxism. I just took it as the ideology that these communist states were using to carry out their objectives and programs and what have you. I never studied the philosophy and never took the philosophy seriously. Because also, do keep in mind that when communism collapsed in 1990, there was a sense that, Marxism is just bullshit. And so how can you take it seriously? And I was in college at that time that it had collapsed and the after effects of its collapse. And so Marxism wasn't taken seriously. If you said you were a Marxist in any sense, I was studying philosophy and history at the time, you were sort of like laughed at. And so it wasn't taken seriously. It was, or not even laughed at. It was worse. You were like sort of like, he's like an idiot, like a retard, like somebody who's actually retarded, and so you're polite to them and just ignore them. Yeah. And so also I, insofar as the communist states were concerned, I studied history, and so I didn't pay attention to their ideology, and I'd never really considered it. And this book by Professor Legutko really opened my eyes. How can I put it? But it was stuff that was already rattling around in my head because, like you, I've been seeing so much of the failings of our liberal democracies as of late. Their intransigence, insofar as certain points are concerned, their unwillingness to entertain any criticism, even as they claim to be open societies, but they're really quite closed and closed-minded. All of these things I've been noticing, perhaps more because right now I'm in a stage in my life where I'm not paying that much attention to earning money and the career and all that, and I'm just thinking about things and the reality around me in more detail and with more time on my hands. But it's something, I have to admit that this book really has been shaking me up because, like I said, it's not that the book itself is so profound. It's a very good book. It's an extremely good book. But it's sort of something that sort of like has catalyzed my head into thinking about things that I hadn't really thought and to finding connections that I hadn't really anticipated, especially because I was educated into thinking that what I believed in was the antithesis of communism, of Marxism. And it never occurred to me. I was never taught or even allowed to think that I was living in the grips of an ideology. And I have been living in the grips of an ideology.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's funny, let's take the thing, something you said there, which I think is a good intro to some of the content of the book. You had said, for those who studied Marxist ideology or something, it was like you treated them as retarded because you had actually studied the history of a lot of these countries, and it just seems fundamentally retarded. History is a good topic to kind of go off of, because first off, the Marxist conception of their historical prerogative is really dig into it fairly retarded at the end of the day. But if you really look at it, it's retarded in the same way that liberal notion of history is retarded.
Yeah.
And it's, this idea, to sum it up very simply, Marxist notions of history is teleological. The idea that all of human progress is a progress. It is a scientific step-by-step process whereby we go from protozoa type primordial thinking to the final advanced stage of human existence, which is this achieved society of socialism where all class distinctions fall apart. The necessity of the state is effectively minimal. We're all just happy-go-lucky, perfectly enlightened beings. Yes, it's ichthyological. It's like we have a fucking goal in mind. But liberalism has the same notion. They still had the concept of we progressed out of the childlike thinking of previous periods to a period where the freedom of the individual is our primary goal. It's our primary operating system. It's an achieved society. You kind of get this, most recently, when Fukuyama says history's over, liberalism won.
Yeah.
But this is old. I mean, there's something called Whig history. For those of you who's studied the history of history writing, will perhaps get this. During let's say the 19th century in particular, Whig history, in British politics, you have the Tories, which are the ultra conservatives, and the Whigs, who would be today's liberals, let's say. And when they write history of Britain, or they write the history of wherever they're from, it's basically this idea. We're reaching the achieved perfect society. You'll get with Whig history an unbelievably self-absorbed attitude. Like they're just so certain of their own historical, moral, and philosophical rectitude that there's just disgust with anything that doesn't come close to, or any paths of history that doesn't come close to that. It's utterly ridiculous in some regards. It's like saying, like, a scientist in the 16th century who was very fond of his heliocentrism. He was like, "Oh, that's the great. There's no science is going to break this. It's so unbelievable." Heliocentrism is a myth. It's all fairly relativistic. The sun isn't the center of the universe. That's how you kind of have to look at this. But we still persist with this Whiggish notion of history. It's really only, funny enough, even though I'm a critic of it, it's only really that postmodernism that they try to stick a fucking pin in that and say you're kind of full of shit in some regards. But no, I'm ranting. But that's actually the first chapter in the Demon and Democracy book, talking about this shared notion of what history means.
Yeah, and I think it's actually kind of essential because what Legutko points out is something profound, that communism had an overt ideology. We're all good communists, right? But liberal democracy is sort of like underground. It permeates the air, but it's odorless and colorless. And it just floats through the ether all around us. And it permeates not just our politics rather, but our social structures, our family structures. And he points out something that is quite true, is that if you look at the paradigm between the young man and the old man, the young man is all like adventuresome and willing to try different things and shake things up and all the rest of it. And the old man is much more cautious in his dealings and much more willing to keep things going and recognizes the value of certain institutions, even though by the same token, he can see their flaws. But between the flaws and the virtues outweigh those flaws, and so he recognizes the value of them, like family, like church, and what have you. Whereas the young man sees only the flaws and seeks to destroy those institutions for the sake of ushering in something new that will replace them. Now, this is, the adolescent attitude and a more mature attitude in juxtaposition. And Legutko, I think, correctly points out that liberal democracy is, at its core, an adolescent ideology, in the sense that it seeks only to change for its own sake almost, and willing to destroy everything just to shake things up. And because any flaw, no matter how small, is justification to abandon something, no matter how useful or valuable. And he sees that in the family relationships, in art, in religion, in everything. And it's a disheartening attitude, because Legutko is fundamentally right. Our liberal democracy that we are calling it progressivism, but it's actually the end state of liberal democracy. And we who are opposed to this kind of like head first rush into this newness, we're called reactionaries or alt-right or hard right or this, that, conservative, what have you. But it's ultimately that we are rejecting the liberal democratic ideal of change for the sake of change. Am I stretching? You tell me.
No, let's say here. There's a couple of interesting things around this, which this book brings up, and it has parallels to Deneen's book. So first thing that kind of comes up when you had brought up the notion, like, why does it seem that liberalism doesn't have, or at least gives the impression that it doesn't have ideology to it? When I especially from my perspective, I think it so clearly does. It may very well be this very success of the matter, which is why it's very hidden. Even if let's take the United States as a particular example. There's some challenges to it that I'll bring up later. The United States is a project, a liberal project, by its almost very definition. It was created from a liberal basis as a critique against the failure of the British system to kind of truly live up to its so-called liberalism. It was constructed as a project, almost like a scientific project, and it still permeates that as it evolves. So at least within the United States, it feels like it's just always been there. It's not like in the 200 some odd, 300 some odd years of the country that, there was this opposition that was ready to make a king and was ready to not be liberal, right? That wasn't really there. In the broader context, liberalism has been around even before, World War I and World War II as like a permeating strong ideology that's just been there, been successful. So it's hard to kind of see when it's so permeated what's kind of going on. I think that's probably truth to it. The other thing that kind of brings up in this book, even though, Deneen liked to point out that, hey, the difference between a classical liberal and a progressive liberal is much less than you think. They both bring up someone who I think is very interesting. They both, in friendly ways, quote de Tocqueville, especially in his commentary on the United States. What you get from that, it's like he's their favorite liberal because he's very critical of democracy. And you even get in Legutko's book, if they have an admiration for anybody in liberalism, it was the very early guys in liberalism or the founders of the United States who had ingrained within their mind the shared heritage of the classicists, the Greeks and the Romans, because they fundamentally understood democracy is a perverted form of government, that all the various forms of government are kind of shitty that are available for organization. And the American project, for all it's a creative new thing, it was a copy of the Greek and Romans idea, which they said, what's the ideal solution? Well, you want to have the best bits of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, and have them basically conflicting against each other to keep things in control. The Greeks and the Romans figured that out already. And these guys had that shared heritage and kept to it. I mean, you do hear positive notions from Legutko on that. What's happened subsequently is that even within, when you start really huffing your own farts of liberalism, I think that's nothing existed prior to this realization that liberalism is the bee's knees. What you pointed out, that everything can be torn asunder, the world belongs to the living, namely whatever's the new thing is the only thing. Even that shared heritage that built the fucking program goes out the window. And I think de Tocqueville recognized that's the path that's probably going to happen. And I think that's why they kind of respect him. And both of their books said, well, let me give you a history of how that happened. And I think it was true.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually don't have my copies of de Tocqueville with me. I have them in storage. And I remember reading them, but I remember my focus was very different. I was much more interested in the reality that he was portraying of the things that he had experienced, as opposed to his political thinking. And I'm realizing, too, that this podcast is a lot more personal because the impact of this book has been much more personal to me. It's made me reevaluate a lot of things that have been going on in my mind. And that I realized that when I read de Tocqueville, I didn't pay attention to the political philosophy, because I'm realizing now that I never really paid attention to political philosophy. When I studied philosophy, I specialized in epistemology. And when I read Hegel, it was more because it was like, oh, I'm going to read Hegel, the toughest guy on the block. And frankly, he defeated me because, I did read Phenomenology of Spirit, but I think I understood maybe 10% of that godforsaken book.
Hegel defeats most people who read them, and there's naturally a question of whether or not there was something that could be, that was there, or it was, and you missed it, or there was nothing there, and he pulled a fast one on you.
Yeah, I'm not sure myself at this point. But leaving that question aside, I studied, I was much more into logic and epistemology than political theory, because I realized now I fundamentally thought that the question of political theory was settled, and I had imbued the spirit, the Kool-Aid, the noxious gas that liberalism was it, liberal democracy was it. I bought into Francis Fukuyama's notion that the end of history was at hand. Yeah. And when people laughed and said, oh, well, 9/11 proves that, Fukuyama was wrong, I was like, oh, you fucking idiot. He wasn't talking about that. He was talking about political development. It's over. This is it. And yeah, I'm realizing I drunk the Kool-Aid on liberal democracy, right? I mean, people were criticizing Fukuyama for the wrong reasons.
Slavoj Žižek had a really good take on that, which was people were always making fun of Fukuyama, and he says, yeah, I get it, making fun of him because, it's the end of, whatever, a fight of ideologies, and suddenly September 11th happened. He says, but here's how he may have had a point. No one who critiques him ever really brings to the table and says, here's how we get out of capitalism and be serious about it.
Right.
And to the extent to which that happens, they can't conceive of a political order which doesn't involve some sort of capitalism and then some sort of liberalism or wrapper around it. Is fundamentally someone who's unintentionally or unconsciously accepted the Fukuyama notion that history's over and that it's won. There's potentially a challenge to it now. It remains to be seen. I don't think Trump in and of himself is a critique of it from the outside. It's maybe some self-critique in there, but it's still liberalism at the end of the day. Steve Bannon's still basically talking about liberalism at the end of the day. It's only some weirdos like us who think outside of it. But yeah, I mean, that it's not weird to think about that, but that just, and this was what the communists, people who are still communists, still recognize today. They know it's an ideology precisely because it's so permeated your worldview that you think it's the only defining
Right.
factors of reality.
Yeah.
And it's just historically has not been true. Like I said, the notion of time has not historically always been linear.
Mm-hmm.
The notion, even like you think about politics, it's like, oh, democracy, it's so perfect and beautiful. It's only in like the past 150 years that democracy has been anything other than a derogatory term.
Yeah.
Seriously, it was in the Aristotelian language already referred. The democracy was a word of
It was a dirty word.
derision.
Yeah.
It was a denatured form of republic. There was a concept in the Greek times. There was the good form, as per usual. There was the good middle ground, like well organized form of a type of political government, and its denatured form. Monarchy was the good form. Its denatured form was tyranny. Republic was the good form. Its denatured form was democracy. Aristocracy, the good form. Its denatured form was like oligopoly, or I forget whatever, or oligarchy, or whatever the word they used.
Oligarchy, I would guess. Yeah.
I think it was. It was only through, frankly, this play of universal suffrage in my mind when it really started to shift. And now it's just constantly, it has to be democratic. It has to be perfectly democratic. Nobody who built this system thought that democracy was anything they wanted, because they knew the mob was fickle.
Yeah, but the thing is, what Legutko accurately points out is that democracy is a system to arrive at compromise over political differences. But in the West, as of late, as of the last 30-odd years or so, or you could argue from the time of the 60s, both democracy has been perverted into a way to change how people live. And the other thing he talks about is the justice system, that the justice system, the activist justice system, changes the way you live as well, and you're obliged to it. Democracy and the liberal judicial system are now cudgels that beat people into submission. And I think that that's fundamentally right. And just a side note, I'm realizing that our justice system is bad because it's unpredictable. Because, you have a situation, some case of some sort, right? Whatever that case may be, a litigation or whatever. And if you know all the facts, you should be able to predict the outcome. If you cannot predict the outcome based on the available facts, then the judicial system you have is corrupted. It's just not, and Legutko points that out, and that's just a tiny aside that he tosses out there. But I went on a tangent, but I'm finding it very difficult. Look, what's happening to me is that I realize that I am living in an ideology, in the grips of an ideology. And it's only now, when I'm comfortably in middle age, that I'm realizing it. And it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating and shocking. And it's something that I'm realizing that I'm going to have to dig myself out of and start reevaluating a lot of things. Because as we've been talking here, one of the things I've been thinking about in the back of my mind is the history of the Pinochet dictatorship, which of course had a huge impact of me, seeing as I grew up under its aegis. And I thought in many ways that it was a very good thing. And but there were elements of it that I didn't really like. But it wasn't the fact that it was a dictatorship. That wasn't the thing that I didn't like. I'm realizing now that what I didn't like is that it was liberal. Because Chilean society before Pinochet the system was putatively democratic, but the country was fundamentally aristocratic. And it was Pinochet that sort of like flipped that around. He made it undemocratic during his 17-year dictatorship, but very liberal. And that's why the neoliberal economic policies found such a handsome fit within the Pinochet paradigm. And it was anti-aristocracy. I mean, the upper classes in Chile have always hated Pinochet's guts, even though they benefited, many of them, from the economic system that he imposed, the neoliberal economic system. And so I'm just giving you one example of something that I'm needing to reevaluate, because I'm realizing that, I've been living I've been a brain in a vat. I've been living in the grips of an ideology. And now that I realize it, I have to do two projects. Number one, reevaluate the things that I thought of just about everything I ever thought, in light of the fact that I was analyzing them or looking at them from the point of view of an ideologue, as I was. And number two, what comes next? What do I start believing in? If it's not this ideology, how do I, start to rethink things? Because we always laugh at Sargon saying shit like, I'm a classical liberal, right? But I fundamentally thought of myself as, yeah, I'm a classical liberal. I'm a good liberal Democrat. I didn't think of it in those terms, and now I'm realizing it's just an ideology, yeah, that's why I'm a little bit like sounding like a fucking idiot and like a little bit inarticulate here. But
here's the thing. To me, the question with this, whenever you recognize ideology, because I think there's ideologies everywhere.
Yeah.
But it's always a question of to what end, right? And I think one of the key elements of this book is the end, in some sense, is a totalitarian one in the strict sense of that word. It's the total element. That not only is there room for enabling a tyranny within this system, I would argue tyranny of the the managerial approach. That everything is scientific. What we're doing, we're not. It's not that we're dictating as class people getting benefits out of it. We are, but we're not going to say that. It's the dictatorship of the system. The system this is the only way it works. It's that we're just managers of everything. We're just bureaucrats. So there's that, but there's also the totalitarian in the sense of total. It's like everything.
Yeah.
So when we mentioned democracy again, think of how people use it. Oh, it's like, we have to be democratic. Everything has to be democratic. Are the movies we think of are superior? Do you have a democratic approach to that?
Yeah, tomato meter,
exactly, not even just the tomato meter. It's like, is it representative of the polis? Do you have the right percentage of Black people, Latinos represented in your films, making the films, whatever you want to take it. Here's what's so funny about that. When you have everything, that notion that everything has to be democratic, imbued in that is everything becomes political, right? Your choice of music is political. What you wear is political. The words out of your mouth are political. Everything is political except the one most important thing, which is basically deciding who rules and why, and taking actual charge of the administration of things.
Yeah.
When you make everything political, what you ignore the fact that actually, do I get to decide who monitors and adjusts the affairs of government? Do I actually decide on key issues? No, it's the managerial class. It's the bureaucratic class that does it. I'm fucking distracted with all these other things that I need to be democratic about, but I sure as shit am not going to control war, taxes, levies like that. Fuck off. You don't do that. It's outsourced completely. And it's a fucking game. And the degree to which this is an ideology making you think that you're being democratic when you're just a spectator is part of the fucking the fantasy. It was always amusing to me. I'm going off on a little tangent, but it's related. The critiques that the liberal Democrats, or let's just say liberals in general, the critique they always love to make against totalitarian states, particularly the fascists, is that there's no real political control there. You've reduced all of politics to a spectator sport. Literally, you line up, you're in the crowds, you cheer the dear leader, and he has absolute control. But you move on. There's nothing. That's just fake politics and everything. You have no control. It's spectator sport. Well, I'm sorry, liberalism is a spectator sport.
Yeah,
right now.
Yeah.
Every so often, we're recording this the day before the midterm election. We have our teams, we cheer them. At the end of the day, we know they're really not going to change too much. You can believe one thing or the other for this election, but by and large, not a lot is going to shift. We're still within the same paradigm. It's a fucking spectator sport. We're not really controlling matters of state in any significant level. And that's where we're at. I mean, and that's why it's not. It's always. To me, again, like I said, my background of reading not just the Marxist critique of liberalism, but then critiquing Marxism itself and knowing where it all comes from, I know this is all a collective ideology of bullshit that we all play off of. And it's funny because liberal democracy is more totalizing than even something like monarchy. Think about what monarchy in the old days was. Yeah, you had some ideology, particularly in a Christian context, of the divine order of things, which enables a divine monarch. But at the end of the day, the only thing that the monarchy really said was that, okay, the rules of law is coming from this one guy, and it'll be kind of like administered downhill. It doesn't really require you to think about all these sorts of ethics. It doesn't require you to dictate what the church is and isn't going to say, really, at the end of the day. It's just an administrative mechanism and procedure. You can't say that for liberal democracy. Everything has to be in accordance with liberal democratic principles. That's another big piece of this book.
Yeah.
Every single goddamn thing has to, it exists only in within democracy, in the democratic approved system. And frankly, that was another thing Legutko was saying. Look, when we were under communism, it was the same fucking thing. You just changed the damn words.
Yeah.
But it operates the same way.
Yeah. And that's the thing that, for instance, the family, his critique of what liberal democracy does to the family, it puts everybody on a level playing field. And therefore, the children have as much right, as the parents, and there is no semblance of authority. And of course, the parents, when they're stripped of that notion of not having any authority, they start behaving like children. And they do. We see that. We see them behaving like children in that selfish and stupid way of children, which is excusable when they're 3 years old, but it's inexcusable rather, when they're 40. Right, and you see parents acting that way, and you see children, challenging authority just for the sake of challenging it, and not listening to things that, quite apart from the fact of listening to authority and paying attention to authority and obeying authority, it's that there is knowledge behind this authority. That fact is dismissed out of hand. The fact that somebody older can know something by the virtue of being older, because there are lots of things that you know when you are older that when you were younger you had no idea or clue or insight into, and that's the thing I find just really interesting, because it's not just the family, it's every institution that is just demolished by the liberal democratic ideology. And when you start looking at that, and from that perspective, you start to see, or I at least am starting to understand, why it is that in these last few decades or a couple of centuries, less than 150 years, 200 years tops, we see, we have this material progress, but we have societal collapse, because the fundamental social cohesion of our society is collapsing in a way that people during the French Revolution say, or even the Russian Revolution would have been just shocked by the fragility of the social connections that we currently have, which it seems to me are a product of the liberal democratic ideology. That, to tell you the truth, until I started really looking into it and frankly reading Legutko's book, it's not that Legutko's book is that brilliant. Okay, I mean It's not that it's oh my God, it's put it up there with the New Testament. It's just another book there that we have to include in the New Testament. No, what it is that, for me at least, the book is a catalyst to a lot of things I've been thinking about over the last couple of years, and so it's sort of it was that final little straw that not broke the camel's back, but cleaved me from the notion. Or made me realize that, yes, I am living in a brain in a vat. I am in the grips of a liberal democratic ideology. And that's why I feel in this podcast I'm just going all over the goddamn place, as opposed to having any kind of coherent thinking, because it really has been for me just a really big sea change. And I have to insist, it's a fine book, okay? And it's interesting ideas, but for me, it's been more personally moving. It also leads me to understand why, for instance, Solzhenitsyn was so ostracized in the West, because he saw in the West what he saw in communism, and the West just didn't want to see that.
It was interesting that a lot of, and it's not all Eastern Europeans. I mean, that's the point of this book. A lot of Eastern Europeans kind of sucked the Kool-Aid as much as anyone. But there was a lot of the dissident Eastern Europeans reached this conclusion. In part, it's similar to, like I said, when I had my Marxist reading. I mean, all of the Eastern Europeans knew what Marxism was saying and the logic behind it. They now go around and they see the same engines at play. You had mentioned, if you really look at what liberalism is doing, a lot of the efforts that you see at play are destructive by intention. Destructive of, these old antiquated ways of thinking about things, be they religious, be they, social constructs like the family, all of these other things, very destructive. Yeah. But, the communists, particularly Marx, saw that as a good thing. And this is why, like I said, a smart reader of Marx knows where he's coming from. He thought capitalism was a wonderful thing because it did that. Because he said it created the necessary soup whereby all of these old notions were reduced to flux. Religion would be easily critiqued. The family was easily critiqued. Highly orchestrated social structures coming out of feudalism were critiqued and torn asunder. He says this is ripe for the next stage of society, for the next stage of revolution, namely his. And that is kind of what the Eastern Europeans caught, because a lot of those Eastern Europeans in this period when everything is literally torn asunder, what's left for a lot of them is religion. And it was the old notion of society, a notion of society which is ancient, but I don't mean to say that it's just old, but it has the continuity. It's the sense that there is something sturdy in a period when things aren't sturdy. And those guys were quicker to perceive the deficiencies in the West, whereas others were kind of more or less okay. Which isn't to say that Eastern Europeans weren't attracted to things like, hey, blue jeans, chewing gum, Coca-Cola, rock music. All of that has its value because it wasn't approved by the communists for whatever reason. Nevertheless, there was a big tradition of a lot of these countries that felt like there was a bitterness to the reality. It's like, oh, we were very hopeful notions of the other, of the great communists, thing that they hated, namely these Western democracies. And then we get in, it's like, oh, that's all we got. Kind of sucks in some regards. And they notice how their fellow communists just loved it and made well so easily. It seems like, especially those countries that had a stronger religious background, are permeated.
Well, actually, what this raises is something else that's kind of interesting, which is the notion that the leaders of Eastern European countries that are good liberal Democrats are the most cynical of them all. Because they understand what's going on, that it's just, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Communism swapped out by liberal democracy. But it's the same shit. It's the same kind of ideology.
And in some regards, you have to, just got to be sympathetic. I understand why this would be the case. Think about in Russia, in Poland, in almost all of these Eastern European countries. You had to be a party member just to kind of get a better life for yourself.
Yeah.
You signed up for the card, even if you didn't believe it and you thought a lot of this was bullshit.
Yeah.
You played the game so you could get a better apartment, better job, a little bit more income, things that, rational people would probably do.
Yeah.
So, you have a lot of leftover guys. It's like, what are you going to do? Is just suddenly execute them all or exercise them from society? It wasn't going to fly.
Yeah.
There's just too many people. And so you make do. And this really ties in to something that was very big in the news for Poland relative to the EU, and something I think people in this country didn't really comprehend what was going on, but basically it was the source of this book. You remember, I don't know if it was this year or last year or whenever it was, Poland got in big trouble with the EU because the new government, not the new government, but the current government, the Law and Justice Party, of which Legutko is a member, just to be fully transparent, they were very big on reforming the Polish judicial system.
Yeah.
Basically, historically, what had happened was, like he had said, there was just so many communists who just made it easy to transition to the new system. Well, one of the big things they held on to was the court system.
Mm-hmm.
It was just one of those, you had all the legal training and background. Okay, these guys are going to stick around in the new courts. These new courts have been fairly sympathetic to the Eastern European, or I'm sorry, not Eastern European, the European Union's attitudes toward a lot of things.
Right.
They're not really democratically elected by any real stretch of the term. And the Law and Justice Party says, no, this has been a problem a lot of us have known for a long time. We just want to figure out a way to change it. Their process of changing it, maybe it wasn't the best system, but that's where it was kind of coming from. The youth said, nope, this is not democratic. How dare you even think of trying the current political party appoint the judicial leaders? We will censure your country. We will fine you. We will hold you in contempt of society, this, that, and the other. This is what he's talking about.
Right.
That fundamental story, which probably was around the time that this book was written. I think this book was written in 2016.
No, it was actually written in 2012 and published in English in 2016.
Right.
But this critique is not new from the Law and Justice Party. So, yeah, it was probably on his mind back when he wrote it in 2012. How could I put it? Yeah, because you start looking at it from these terms of liberal democracy being an ideology, and the EU's whole project becomes much more sinister. And so many things that are going on in the West become a lot more sinister and a lot more, it's not a democratic expression of the people's will. It's the managerial class. And that's the other thing that I wanted to touch upon is that both you and I went to the finishing schools of the bureaucracy, of the corporate governmental bureaucracy. And because we both went to Ivy League schools or nominally Ivy League schools, right? You start to realize, how can I put this? I am realizing that so much of my education when I was at Dartmouth was this kind of like drinking the Kool-Aid, being the good liberal Democrat. Okay. When I say liberal Democrat, I keep thinking of the British Party, but of course I don't mean in that sense, in that partisan sense. I'm talking about the ideological sense of viewing liberty, personal liberty as the be-all, end-all value, and democracy as the only system of government. I didn't quite fit into that paradigm because I'd lived under the Pinochet dictatorship, which the term, of course, it's a dictatorship, but by the same token, it was more responsive to the people and the people's will than the previous democracy in Chile had been. And so I had a kind of odd education insofar as the democracy was concerned. I didn't think it was the be-all, end-all. And also I realized the obvious fact that if in a democracy you have only a choice between vanilla and slightly more vanilla, then you don't really have a choice now, do you? It's not really a democracy. It's just managed choice. And you're being given the illusion of democracy, but not real, the real possibility of choice, and therefore the real possibility of change, right? That's something that I'd always recognized, probably because of my upbringing under the Pinochet dictatorship. And so the whole thing is very enlightening for me.
There was a really good a little exercise in the book that was having fun with interpreting a famous quote that Churchill made. You all listening probably know what it is, which was to say, Churchill said, the equivalent of it is, democracy is the worst form of government man has conceived, except for all the other ones.
Right.
And it was a line intentionally meant to be kind of funny and ambiguous in that Churchillian kind of way. But Legutko spent a lot of time in this book analyzing how people interpret that. And he says, well, really, if you look at how people have interpreted that recently, the notion that something's ambiguous means there's multiple interpretations. But there's an oppressive notion, which is to say, here's how you interpret what that thing that Churchill said was. You basically have to say that, one, all systems other than democracy are worse than democracy. 2, democracy is the best political system. 3, democracy must not be criticized because such criticism may undermine something for which there is no better alternative. 4, only democracy is acceptable, and therefore all changes and adjustments in democracy can be performed by democratic means. 5, the remedy for the weaknesses of democracy is more democracy. It's funny because that is basically, I think, the interpretation a lot of people I know of who know that quote try to take from that, which is to say, yeah, it kind of sucks right now, but really everything else is worse. So you just, yo, dog, I'm going to fix your democracy with more democracy. It's similar also to, it was funny when Keynes read Hayek's critique of Keynesianism, more or less, in like The Road to Serfdom, or his critique of planning in general.
Mm-hmm.
He says, you're right, planning kind of sucks right now, but the solution to that is more planning. It's the same exact fucking logic, which is to say, there's nothing really better. So how dare you hypothesize something else? If you are, you're literally Hitler.
Yeah.
Let us solve it internally. This is the fundamental air, the oxygen that is required to fuel the flame of a totalitarian ideology, which is that nothing can exist without outside of itself.
Well, that's the thing that I wanted to turn the conversation to, and as we sort of like, we've been going on 50 minutes on this thing. I hadn't even realized the time, but okay. What I wanted to turn a little bit to is this notion that Legutko has, which of course we've all been watching this, we've all been seeing this, but Legutko articulates it, that the liberal democracy is ultimately a totalitarian regime. It has always been a totalitarian regime. It's not that it's headed towards it. It always has, and it's been totalitarian because it limits your opportunity of choice. And so you are hemmed in, but you feel, oh, those are just the natural limits, like all ideologies are very good at, of just saying, oh, you can't do that because you can't. And therefore you're like, oh, like a good sheep, like a good cattle, and within the bounds of the fencing. You're like, okay, then I'll do as you say. I'll go the way you say. It reminds me, by the way, of, Temple Grandin, the autistic cattle handler. I mean, the genuine...
No, I don't know.
Okay, Temple Grandin is this veterinarian, and she is truly autistic. And what happened was that she's famous for having designed these cattle management chutes, okay? Because of her autism, for some reason, she's able to empathize with animals more than people. And so she designed these systems of chutes for cattle, for the slaughtering of cattle, that is just comprised a series of curves. And you should look it up. Temple Grandin is her name. And she created these chutes that are essentially these curves. That as the animals go through these chutes, since they're only curves, the animals quite naturally go in the direction that the human beings want them to go. Okay, the slaughterhouse wants them to go in a very calm and passive way. The animals don't feel stress or strained because of these chutes. And so they quite naturally and in a very docile manner get to the position where they are slaughtered, where they get to a chute and the chute holds their necks, and they're very happy when the little rod goes into their skull and zaps them and, kills them, of course. Kills them instantly and painlessly and without suffering. And it's a little bit like that. That's what you start to realize about democracy, the democracy that we're living in, that we are in a series of cattle chutes, and that we are going towards our end. And that for the longest time, we've thought that we've been just grazing along. We haven't realized that we've been in this Temple Grandin chute going to our execution. You see what I'm saying? And the totalitarianism, it's always been baked into the system, but we're coming to its end. You see what I'm saying? Because the Deneen book that we read the other time, right, was saying that, it might end in totalitarianism. And Legutko is saying, no, it was always totalitarian. And when you start seeing that it's totalitarian, that truly is, as we are starting to see now, that's when you start to see that the end of the system is coming into view. Because we all agree that there are totalitarian elements like the deep state, the rampant abuse of certain people, whistleblowers, who are just spreading true information and critical information of the Western democracies, and that the members of the deep state, the bureaucracy, the entrenched bureaucracy, does not want revealed or discussed, the indoctrination of people in the educational system, and all this other stuff that we have been critiquing on our side of the political fence. That it's basically we are coming to the realization that it is totalitarian, or that it's headed to a totalitarianism. I had thought before Legutko's book that The totalitarianism that the Western democracies was headed towards was a negative consequence of this crisis of legitimacy of the Western liberal democracies. But Legutko's book is pointing out, or has made me come to the realization, that it was always totalitarian, and that we're realizing it more consciously because we're coming to the end. You see what I'm saying?
Well, I think the situation's even worse than that.
Oh, great!
If I'm deadly serious. I think if the totalitarianism were just various institutions within the governments and society that operated with extreme power and extreme prejudice, that would be bad, but it's a thing that you can kind of respond to. What's worse is the degree to which the totalitarian thinking is imbued within all of us. And I think there's a great line from one of my favorite films, My Dinner with Andre, and Andre Gregory says, it's like we're prisoners in a concentration camp, but we're also simultaneously the guards and are very proud of the prison that we've built for ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's the situation we're in. We have adopted totalitarian thinking without even thinking that it is. You don't have to think too hard to realize examples of this. I mean, anytime, let's say someone says something which is virulently racist or anti-Semitic or whatnot, things that are against the typical ideologies that we have in our country. Think how quickly people are to attack that person, shut them down, ostracize them from society, get them fired from their job. That's extending further and further as we speak. The exact definitions of what's taboo grows more and more, especially the more quote unquote democratic we get. And so ironically enough, the more democratic we get, the less open we are, which seems to be a contradiction in terms. I would always said that I'm democratic in my friends, and that it doesn't matter what political persuasions they have, what class they came from, frankly, even what race or religion they have. I can easily be friendly with them.
Yeah.
This democratic notion we have democratic ideology, but what is permitted and not permitted in that gets more extenuated day by day, to the point where there's very limited bands of acceptable thought before we start sicking the dogs on you, and the companies are more than happy to acquiesce to that.
Yeah.
That's the internalized totalitarian mechanisms that we've all seemingly have adopted, or even if not all of us, enough of us.
Yeah.
To the point where it is fundamentally operating like a totalitarian state, even if you don't have the institutions. You think about it's a private company.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Or, hey, freedom of you have freedom of speech, not freedom from consequence. Yuck, yuck, yuck.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the speech of a totalitarian.
Yeah, fucking A it is. Yeah. And they don't even realize it. It's so bizarre. But yeah, you start to realize that these people are in the grips of a totalitarian ideology. And I think that's the creepiest part, to realize that I've been living in the grips of an ideology that is fundamentally totalitarian. Like I suppose all ideologies are. I don't know. I'm just floating that out there. But it's just so creepy, because the thing is, see, we haven't realized it because this system that we have is so efficient. Also, I think that there's a difference. I think that a difference between communism and liberal democracy is that, see, I think it became totalitarian as opposed to, well, actually, I don't know. I'm going to have to reread de Tocqueville, to tell you the truth, because I'm realizing that maybe it was always there from the get-go, and some of the more astute observers like de Tocqueville saw it, that it was ultimately totalitarian, or at that time he didn't have the conception of a totalitarian state because it hadn't been created yet. But I'm going to have to reread him to see if he had inklings of where it could possibly go, because it's just profoundly creepy to realize that this system that seems so good, that seems sort of like the end of history, as Fukuyama called it, is just not just another ideology, but just as bad as the others. It's just more efficient in the material sense. How could it? Go
And
ahead.
Legutko's very clear about this. He says, "Look, I would be a fool to ignore the material benefits you are literally going to get out of this system. It's measurable. It's very, objectively there. Nevertheless, it's still a mechanism whereby it kind of bribes control. You had mentioned, that slaughterhouse type where, the paths are constructed in such a way as to calm the cattle before they're getting slaughtered. Well, that calming mechanism, or to use or to reference Huxley, the soma that we're dealing with, are all of these legitimately good things that
Yeah.
come our way. All material well-being, choices and choices in products,
Yeah.
a wide plethora of restaurants. There's value
Ethnic
to that. I won't deny
restaurants.
it. An ethnic restaurant. I mean, there's value to that. I won't deny. But to what end and what cost do you have? That's the key there. And I think where you were kind of going is, did liberalism become totalitarian, whereas like communism was to begin with? I think arguably you could, I may be on thin ground here, but you could say it this way: because communism / Marxism was born as a critique within and of liberalism, it's emerged under a recognition that there was problems with the liberal system that was resulting in basically abuses of power, if you want to just take them at their word. And so their response was not necessarily to just be the good guys, but their response was, look, we have to use these mechanisms to achieve a better end. And so if they were prone to totalitarianism, it was in response to what they perceived as totalitarian tendencies. They wouldn't use the word totalitarian because that's a 20th century post-World War II concept that wasn't there in Marxism, but you could argue that, yes, it was kind of prototypical of that. But I think if you were going to try to make the case, that's probably where you would go about that. Marxism is a little bit more self-conscious of the political project and tools it's using, whereas liberalism is trying to, in some sense, talking out of both ends of its mouth. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But this is going to go deep into reading of Marxist. I mean, I almost said theology, but realized that that's probably was the word I was looking for. Their ideology and theology. I'm more than happy to discuss that at a later episode, but I think that's tied to it.
I'd like to revisit this at some in a future podcast, because this is something that I'm realizing is it's sort of like one of those explosions that's like in slow motion. I mean, guys who are listening to this will know. When you get kicked in the balls, at first it actually doesn't hurt, but then it sort of like blooms. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And it's very unpleasant. Okay, women, trust us. Okay, getting hit in the balls, the actual impact is not that big of a deal, but we wince and grimace instantly because we know that in a few seconds that pain is going to blossom and we're just going to be keeled over, and which is of course the case. Okay. I feel a little bit like that. Like this book in and of itself, it was. I don't want to give the book any kind of demerits, but at the same time, I don't want to elevate the book as the be all end all. Okay, I think it's a very, very good book, but because of its impact on me personally, I cannot give a very balanced assessment of the book insofar as its true importance. I can only recognize that in my own case of sort of like realizing, holy shit, I am living under an ideology. I've always been living under this ideology, and I've been complicit in this ideology in many ways, and have viewed the reality and the history of the past and things that are going on around me under from behind the goggles of this ideology. And I have to take them off and revisit so many things that I thought were settled. It's discombobulating, and at the same time, it's kind of thrilling. And at the same time, on the third hand, if you will, it's sort of like, shit, I got to do all this work again, because I thought that so many issues, I'd settled them in my head. And so the notion that I have to resettle these issues or come to a new understanding of various issues, history and philosophy and even the arts, it's a little bit dispiriting. You know what I'm saying?
No, I get you. I mean, it's the Marxist re-education center. It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's true. There's some element to that. And there are many different little chunks that you could go at it. I think it's too late to discuss it, but I think for a later discussion, Legutko's take on liberalism and communism vis-a-vis religion.
No, yeah, we're going to hit this book
worthy of
again.
its own topic.
Yeah, we're going to hit this book
again. It's worthy of its own topic, and partly because his solution it revolves around it. He thinks Christianity is the only outside force that could potentially exist. But I think this is why it also stresses a very Polish book. The situation in Poland is such that that's a more viable solution than most of others, and it isn't just because Poland is religious. There's a lot more to it than just more Poles believe in God. It's part of the whole history of the country.
Yeah, because like one of the things that I'm realizing retrospectively, I kept kind of wondering what the hell is this thing of denying the inherent differences between people, because it's so obvious that men and women, there are differences, objective differences between men and women. There are objective differences between different races. To pretend otherwise is just stupid. Look, the very fact of the hue of the skin of people from Africa and people from Northern Europe, say, the differences of that color, that points to the fact that there are differences. I mean, we're all not like gray people. I mean, if anybody ever read The Lathe of Heaven, they'll know the reference. That one of the main character, he could dream of things, and every dream that he dreamed became reality. And so he dreamed that everybody was the same. And so when he woke up, everybody had turned gray. There were no races. But of course, that's not the case. We all know that there are differences, and the objective reality of these differences is denied, even as the differences, the obvious statistical reality of these differences just smacks people upside the head, and they still deny it. And I'm like, why would they deny such an obvious fact? And yeah, I'm realizing, of course, that they're living under under the liberal democratic ideology that insists that we're all the same, because it can only work if we're all the same. And so many things that are going on in the political reality today are based on this ideology, and I just hadn't realized it. It's just such a bizarre. You see what I'm saying? Yeah, I mean,
the phrase of "it's a kick in the balls" or "it's a bucket of ice water on the face" is real.
Yeah.
And it's why I brought up the question directly to Deneen when I had said, "Look, what you're fundamentally forcing people to confront in this country is that there was a problem with the American project from the get-go, because the American project from the get-go is a liberal project." And I think he kind of recognized where I was going from that. And I think that's true. I mean, a lot of the people in our audience have internalized, myself included, the inherent rectitude of a lot of the founding principles of this country. And the truth of the matter is that a lot of those founding principles, taken to their ideological conclusions, can cause problems. Now, I don't think that I would throw away all the baby with the bathwater by any means, but you have to kind of confront that. And I think above and beyond, even if you never thought about the founding fathers, let's leave that aside. If you just think of where we are now, what is good, what is bad, it's been so endeared and ingrained in you that you get deprogrammed. It's the whole notion, sorry to repeat the cliche, of why we have that concept of taking the red pill. Taking the red pill isn't just becoming more Republican.
Yeah.
That is silly. Taking the red pill, in that reference to the Matrix, is fundamentally about deprogramming the core assumptions of what you think is right and what the reality is. And just switching parties, that's not enough.
Yeah.
Reality of it is you're switching your fundamental judgment values, notions of what is real and what's not. And that's just that's not pleasant in reality.
Not at all. No, it's very deeply unpleasant. Because like in the movie The Matrix, the guy's unplugged and he takes like 5 minutes of screen time to like, oh my God, this is whoa, and then he's hunky dory. The reality is that it takes a long time once you sort of like reach a point of real change, of real understanding about what's going on around you. And I suppose that I've just taken the red pill insofar as recognizing that I've been living under an ideology. I'd never thought of it. I think that that's the thing. I thought that there were like these societal lies as opposed to me being in the grips of an ideology, and that the people I was critiquing were those who just had who were more deeply in the grips of this ideology. Because I think that that's what was going on, for me at least, is that, see, they always say that Americans are very parochial and that they should travel. And that once they travel and see the rest of the world, they get a wider perspective on reality. I would argue that what happens is that the more you travel, the more you realize that you are living under an ideology, and you reject it more thoroughly. You just don't truck with that ideology as much. And yeah, we're going to have to revisit this book again. I don't even know if it's any good, to tell you the truth, because you read it with more objectivity than I did. Is it a good book? I mean, I thought it was a little bit convoluted sometimes.
Honestly, I thought it was a little bit more of a chore to read than Deneen's book.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one, I thought because I had read Deneen's book already, there were large sections of this book that I thought were repetitive of that, so I was, rushing through those.
Yeah, but give the guy credit; he was there before Deneen.
Yeah, and that's fair. And the other element of the book, it did not feel as easy to read. It felt more like a professor's collection of notes. Not to say that it's inconsistent or incoherent. It was just that kind of writing.
Yeah, a tougher read.
It was definitely a tougher read. And there were a couple of, and these are just so tactical as to be inconsequential. There were a couple areas I'm like, I don't think that's the right exact interpretation of what was going on at this historical assessment, but that's neither here nor there. But you add those up together, and to me it was a little bit less enjoyable than Deneen's book, but still fundamentally worth it. And like I said, I just warn people in advance, there's specific references to Polish history, culture, what have you, that I guarantee you it's going to float over your heads, not because, you're not clever. It's just assuming the audience would know it.
It's just cultural baggage that you don't necessarily, it's not necessary. It's not that you would necessarily know that cultural baggage because it's Polish, but also I don't think that it detracted from the book. It was nothing like essential that if you had not read it, you would not understand it. You know what I mean?
Right.
So,
right. Yeah, exactly. But so I just wanted people to be aware of that. So, don't start freaking out if there's a reference to a book called Fjördurka that you don't understand what that means, or there's another book called The Promised Land. If you don't know what that means.
Oh, can you do me a favor? Yeah. I don't know how much Polish you actually know. And this is an unprepared question, but the actual title of the book, "The Demon and Democracy," is a great title. But in the copyright page, it has the actual title. If you don't have it in front of you, I can't read it. What does it mean?
I know. Triumph something post politics. I don't read Polish very well. I will have to get back to you on that, but it is definitely not Demon and Democracy.
We're going to do another episode on the book, so I'll leave a link to the Amazon where you can find the book. And it's an unaffiliated link, so just feel free to click it and know that nobody's making money off of that link. And click it, check out the book, and we're going to do another episode on this book at some point in the not too distant future. Okay? So on that note, this has been the Coach and Benway podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time. Take it easy.
Later.